Welcome back to Project 613. Today we are going to learn 4 mitzvot on the topic of the Torah's agricultural laws and the various gifts that a farmer has to leave for the poor. The first mitzvah has to do with something called leket. And leket means that the stalks that fell during the time of harvest, the Torah tells us they need to be left for the poor, and the farmer is not allowed to take them for himself. And this in fact makes up 2 separate mitzvot, because you have a positive mitzvah where the Torah tells us that it's a mitzvah for the farmer to leave the fallen stalks for the poor, and then you have the parallel negative prohibition where the Torah tells us it's forbidden for the farmer to take them for himself. We know this from the verse that says V'leket kitzircha lo telaket, you shall not take the fallen stalks for yourself. That's a prohibition. And then le'ani v'lager ta'azovatam, rather you shall leave them for the poor. That is the positive mitzvah of what should be done. Now this mitzvah applies specifically to 1 or 2 fallen stalks. That's when the Torah says that they need to be left for the poor. If it's more than that, if it's 3 or more, then the owner is allowed to take them for himself. It's not considered something that was fallen and left behind. Biblically, this law applies only in the land of Israel, but rabbinically, this law is kept in the diaspora as well. Interesting historic note on this law is that it's only because this law was observed that King David came to be. You see, King David descends from Ruth. Ruth was a poor woman who was collecting the leket on the field of Boaz. And Boaz observed Ruth's modesty, and he also observed how Ruth was aware of this specific law where she was only collecting 1 or 2 individual stalks and not piles that had more. And Boaz was impressed with Ruth, and this led Boaz to get to know Ruth and eventually married her, and from there descended King David. So really, King David's being came about as a result of this law of leket being observed correctly. So these are the first 2 mitzvot that we have today. Number 1, of leaving the leket, leaving the 1 or 2 fallen stalks for the poor, and number 2, of the farmer not taking them for himself. The 3rd and 4th mitzvah that we learned today are very similar to this, but rather they apply to underdeveloped clusters of grapes, where the Torah tells us that they too need to be left for the poor. And here again we have 2 mitzvot. We have the positive mitzvah telling us that the underdeveloped clusters of grapes need to be left for the poor, and then we have the parallel prohibition telling us that it's forbidden for the owner to take them for himself. As the verse says, V'charmecha lo ta'olel, that's the prohibition. You shall not take the underdeveloped grapes for yourself. Rather, le'ani v'lager ta'azovatam, you shall leave them for the poor. This mitzvah applies only to grapes. It doesn't apply to the fruit of any other trees. It's specifically a mitzvah of grapes. Any other fruits, the owner is allowed to take even the underdeveloped ones, but when it comes to grapes, we have this specific mitzvah where the Torah tells us that over here, we shouldn't be so greedy as to take even the underdeveloped clusters of grapes. Rather, they should be left for the poor. More on the Torah's laws of the gifts that have to be left for the poor we will be learning in the coming days. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.